welcome back to Queerly Natural. I'm Alana.
And I'm Sage. Here at Queerly Natural, we have research-based discussions about sexuality, sex, and gender in nature.
Join us monthly for an episode about a different plant, animal, fungus, or microbe, and learn with us about their lives and how it relates to queer identities in humans.
In a world that tells humans that being queer is wrong, abnormal, and sets us apart from the other life on this planet, we are here to show you the opposite is true.
Based on what nature shows us, being queer is clearly natural.
Welcome back to another episode of Queerly Natural. Today we will be talking about a lichen.
I'm excited. I love lichens. I think we're going to like this episode.
I think you will. So the lichen we will be talking about is called Loberia pulmonaria, or also known as the tree lichen, lung lichen, oak lungs, or oak lungwort.
It's very breathy. Loberia pulmonaria?
Yep, Loberia pulmonaria.
Does pulmonaria relate to lung? Pulmonary system.
Yeah, like if you think of pulmonary diseases are diseases of the lung.
It also just has like a nice cadence to it. It kind of goes up and down when you say it. Loberia pulmonaria.
They really did a good one with this. You'll see the pictures, but it's named lungwort for a reason. Loberia pulmonaria, we're going to call it lungwort for the rest of the episode, can be found worldwide, and it thrives most in moist climates. There are records of collection in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, though a comprehensive distribution map for this species doesn't exist yet.
That's sad.
Yeah, which it's the case for a lot of
lichens
and fungi.
And fungi.
Yeah. Unfortunately. So if anyone's interested in studying that, I'd like to know the distribution map of this species. I don't know who else out there wants to know, but
someone give Sage money to just go explore and find lichen.
That would be my dream. I would do that any day. For anybody out there hiring. A lichen hunter.
Lichenologist.
Lichenologist. Oh, that is a real job.
It is. There's not many, but it does exist.
True. Yeah. All you lichenologists out there, the very few of you there are, thank you. You're doing great work. So they can be found worldwide, but they are relatively rare. Like they're found in each place, but where they are, they're not very common. But they are pretty prolific in some places. On North America, they're found in the Pacific Northwest, which, like we said, they thrive in moist climates, so that fits the bill. But the Pacific Northwest has 6 species of Loberia, and Loberia pulmonaria, or lungwort, is the most common.
Cool.
So, a little intro to the species. I think next up you should try to describe it.
All right. Oh, it's a good one.
Right.
It's a good lichen. So I think this is common amongst most lichens, but color-wise, it varies a lot depending on time of year and temperature and weather patterns. So it goes from this almost dead looking greenish brown to really vibrant bright green. It's probably just rained in some of these pictures. The lung name, it has these leafy structures that kind of branch into 2, and then they have 3 little points on each end. And so it's kind of, I want to say foliose is the correct term for the lichen. It's been a while since I did my lichen terms.
No, that's right. That's a really good one.
Woo! So basically, if you imagine a 2-pointed leaf split kind of like a lung coming into 1 point at the end, so like a Y shape, and put the bottom of the Y, attach that to the tree. That's kind of how it goes. It's got a bunch of them, different sizes, and as they expand out, there's just more and more of them. So what it's attached to is tree bark. It looks like a combination of both standing and maybe fallen trees. So I think it's not particular about whether it's alive or dead. It's crinkly, so it's not smooth. It's kind of like a little bit pitted. And yeah, kind of the base of that Y shape has a bunch of smaller little Ys and then like a bigger one, if that makes sense. I'm trying to say I can't find any photos obvious to me to have the fruiting structure.
If you go 4 rows down.
Oh, is it like an orangey red cup or is that a disc?
Yeah, the orange red disc is it.
Okay, yeah. So the fruiting structure are these like tiny little orange red discs that seem to be appearing on the edge of that leaf structure. So kind of along the edge of your Y shape. They seem that it goes from like a little tiny cup to like a flatter disc. And I think that's all I've got.
That was really good. These things are...
It's very pretty.
They're so pretty, but they're pretty hard to describe, honestly. Let me find my official description.
Okay, yeah, I see the other disc picture. I wasn't sure if that was the fruiting structure because it's such a different color or it was growing with some mushrooms.
No, right. The fruiting structures sometimes look like they don't belong on the organism, but nope, the orange, red on the green, those are the same thing. Really cool.
They're a good one.
So if I say a word and I don't explain it, but I should, please stop me. Lobaria pulmonaria is a foliose lichen.
What's foliose mean?
Thank you. So that means it's raised from the surface of whatever it grows on, or in other words, the substrate. And the way it's raised off the surface makes it look like a crinkled up, like fallen leaf, if that makes sense.
Yeah, can you give an example of what a non-foliose lichen might look like?
Yeah, other growth forms of lichens include crustose lichens. So a crustose lichen wouldn't have like raised edges or protrude from the substrate at all. It would just kind of look like it was like glued on there, and it would be completely adhered.
Have you ever seen like a colorful rock?
Right. A lot of the time, the colors formed on rocks that are modeled, those like different spots are caused by lichens a lot of the time, usually crustose lichens, especially if they don't have any sort of like form that protrudes at all. And there's other forms of lichens, like for example, script lichens. Script lichens are mostly embedded in the surface of the substrate, usually tree bark, and they literally look like somebody scribbled on the tree, and the sort of like lines or markings that they are just kind of exposed, like fruiting structures and everything they need to carry out their life cycle. It's pretty cool. Other common growth forms of lichens are squamulose, or lichens that look like little pebbles, and fruticose, or lichens that are made of freestanding branching tubes. Growth form describes the general shape of the lichen, and all individuals of a species will have the same growth form. Foliose lichens are flatter than fruticose lichens, though lungwort protrudes quite a bit, right, Alana?
Yeah.
Like, they stick out quite a lot. They're called a macro lichen because they're so big. So, yeah. The edges of this one are very raised. They can protrude quite a lot, and they're quite crinkly looking. The body of the lichen, which is also called the thallus, is leathery in texture and lobed on the surface. Lobed means that the edge has protrusions similar to the edge of an oak or dandelion leaf. So that's what Ilana was referring to when she was referring to like the Ys or the like splits in it. It kind of like branches out in kind of a webbed structure. It's hard to describe.
Yeah, so basically the thallus is what I was saying was kind of like a leaf-like structure. I wanted to use terms that made sense for thinking about it.
No, absolutely. Like I said, it's pretty hard to describe, but the way the edges protrude and stuff does resemble like an oak or a dandelion leaf.
Yeah, I'd say definitely more like, I think oak more.
Oak does make sense because other names for this lichen are oak lungs or oak lungwort. Sometimes the name can tell you a lot. The top surface of the lichen has a web of ridges. The top is green when moist, and when dry turns brown or gray and papery in texture. The lower surface of the lichen, so the surface that's most close to the substrate, has a fine layer of hairs. The thallus can grow to be up to 5 to 15 centimeters in diameter, with individual lobes measuring 1 to 2 centimeters wide and 7 centimeters long. So there are 30 centimeters in a foot. These things can get pretty big, like 6 inches in diameter would be the same as 15 centimeters.
It's a big lichen.
Yeah, right. Like, it doesn't sound super big, but some other lichens are microscopic. Even this one, you need like a hand lens or some sort of a zoom in photography device to get a good picture of the discs that Alana was talking about, or the fruiting structures. And especially like the script lichens or the crustose lichens, like those can get teeny, teeny, tiny. The reproductive structures of lungwort are present on the upper surface of the thallus, and those are the red-brown discs. Cephalodia, or spots that are darker green than the general color of the upper surface, are present on the underside of the thallus. And I will explain what cephalodia are later.
Ooh.
The thallus is loosely attached to the substrate by rhizines or filaments. And so these are on the bottom. They're attaching the thallus, but they're not roots. Lichens don't have roots. These rhizines don't help the lichen absorb nutrients or water. They simply anchor the thing to whatever it's growing on. And I will also explain more what rhizines are later. Not to keep you in suspense, but you gotta listen to the whole thing. Sorry. But that's the end of my description.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I love lichens. They're pretty much found everywhere. This one's pretty rare, but you know, you can go out and look at a tree trunk and there can usually be like 3 or 4 species.
Yeah, and one thing I love about lichens, and I think most do this, if not all, is like just that color change. Like if it's been really dry recently and then like after a good rain, like it's just wild how different the color can be, and it really changes like the atmosphere of where you are.
Absolutely. Especially after it rains, they can be pretty vibrant. Like some of them can be like sulfur yellow.
It's like you put on one of those fancy filters that make everything look like fairy tale, but you don't even need one because the lichens do it themselves.
Right. They're gorgeous. And this one is especially gorgeous. I've never seen it. I am not sure where they grow on the East Coast, if they grow here at all, but I'd love to see the Pacific Northwest. A dream.
You gotta find it.
So that's what they look like. On to their ecology. So, like I said before, lungwort can be found worldwide in moist climates, so mostly coastal or mountainous regions. In these habitats, lungwort can be found on tree trunks, in tree canopies, on shrubs, or on mossy rocks. So those are pretty harsh environments if you think about it. Like tree trunks, canopies, none of those places have soil.
It's pretty varied too.
Yeah, it is pretty varied. The different elevations and the different proximities to the ground. It's pretty interesting. And I imagine the humidity is pretty different between like a rock on the ground or like a tree trunk too. But as long as it's humid enough, they can, you know, make a go of it. But these places have no soil, so there's no like water retention ability. Like soil can retain water for a good amount of time after it rains, but like on a tree trunk, it'll be soaked for a while after a good rain, but eventually it dries out and then there's nothing for the lungwort to absorb. So lungwort is not a particularly hardy lichen. We'll kind of talk about how it's declining and how it's sensitive to several ecological disturbances. But other lichens, like especially the crustose rock lichens, they can dry out for a good amount of time and still survive. Lungwort is found in these humid environments, aren't as difficult to live in as like a drier one, but it's still relatively difficult with the lack of soil and everything.
Yeah, they can be sensitive to a lot of pollutions and stuff like that.
Yeah, right. I have a section about that too. So we'll talk more about the specific pollutants they're sensitive to and such. Other lichens, they can grow on concrete and stuff. Like, they can grow pretty much anywhere, but this one's pretty sensitive. So since they grow on tree trunks and mossy rocks and such, they're usually growing on a plant, which makes them an epiphyte. Epiphytes are a type of organism that lives on the surface of a plant. These epiphytes, including lungwort, are not parasitic. They just live physically on the plant's surface, so they have a pretty neutral impact on the plant as they grow. They're not taking any of the tree's nutrients. They're not blocking any of its sunlight. The tree can live to its full potential, and the lichen just kind of hangs on the side and doesn't really impact it at all. Lichens, including lungwort, have the unique ability to dry out completely and become revived when water is available again. So that's, like I was talking about before, they have to be pretty hardy to live where they live, and this adaptation helps them get by. As I mentioned before, the rhizines or anchoring threads on the bottom of the lichen are not roots. They don't help the lichen absorb water or nutrients. So as a result, the lichens absorb water through the surface of their thallus. And if it doesn't rain, or if it's not foggy or humid enough, then they have no way of getting more water because there's no soil to retain it, and they have no other way of absorbing it. So between rains, lichens will become shriveled and dull, and they can stay that way for sometimes pretty extended periods of time, depending on the tolerance of the specific species. But then the next time it rains, they'll just perk back up again, and they'll generally become greener than they were in the dry state. Lungwort is a pretty mossy green when it's wet, and when it's dry, it can become like a gray-green or a dark brown. Lungwort is an autotroph, meaning it photosynthesizes its own nutrition. It doesn't eat anything. It uses sunlight, carbon, and water to create its own carbohydrates. But lungwort is consumed by animals, including deer and moose, as well as microscopic insects and mollusks like slugs and snails.
I just love a good snail.
Right? And picturing them as predators is just silly to me. Even though they are, they eat a lot and they can devastate gardens.
I was just picturing if you really dislike your neighbor, you just release a bunch of snails in their lawn.
No, for real, that would mess them up because snails are voracious.
I know slugs are bad too, so.
Yeah, right. But they love a good lichen.
I mean, I love a good lichen, but in a different way.
Yeah, right. I don't want a lichen salad, personally. Maybe if I was desperate, but...
You can eat most lichens. Not all, but I think most. They're just not necessarily that tasty.
Not ideal, and they grow very, very slowly. So, in respect of the energy it takes the lichen to create X amount of body mass, I would rather leave it than, just use it as a quick snack.
Yeah.
After all that investment, it makes me feel bad.
Yeah, you would decimate the lichen population in the area just for a snack.
Yeah, exactly. You would go and maybe get a couple bites and it would be, 5 years of growth for this lichen.
Yep.
But deer and moose, they gotta do what they gotta do. We'll give them a pass. We have other options. But chipmunks and birds will also use lungwort as well as other lichens as nesting material. Lungwort is an important source of nutrients in forest ecosystems because it absorbs nitrogen. So in nutrient cycles in forests, so you probably heard of the water cycle, there's also a carbon cycle, a nitrogen cycle, a phosphorus cycle, ways that these nutrients are introduced and used and then reintroduced to the environment. But nitrogen in a lot of forest environments is a limiting nutrient, meaning that it's the nutrients that's stopping further growth of a lot of organisms there. If there were more nitrogen, then X amount of more growth could happen. But since there's so little nitrogen, that's what's limiting it. But lungwort is a very important factor because there are very few organisms that can make nitrogen available to living beings. Our atmosphere is approximately 78% nitrogen. However, it's so scarce because this atmospheric nitrogen is not absorbable for a lot of organisms. Like we as humans cannot use atmospheric nitrogen. We get nitrogen from our food, like a lot of other living beings do. So the ones that can use atmospheric nitrogen are super important for everyone else. So lichens can absorb this atmospheric nitrogen, and the way that other organisms can absorb nitrogen is by nitrate ions or ammonium ions. Lungwort can fix atmospheric nitrogen into these bioavailable nitrate or ammonium forms, and then after the lichen falls off the substrate onto the forest floor, it decomposes, and then those nitrate ions or ammonium ions are deposited in the soil where plants can absorb them. So they're pretty important to that nitrogen cycle. Yeah. Lungwort, like many lichens, produces its own unique cocktail of chemical compounds. And these chemicals include acids. Some of the ones I saw were stictic acid, gyrophoric acid, constictic acid. I don't know what any of these are.
Long names. Very, very long names.
Yeah, there were about 10 more, but all those are found in lungwort. And in addition to these acids, there are pigments and steroids. So the acids serve as protection against herbivory by the grazers that we mentioned, the deer and the moose, as well as the mollusks, so the slugs or snails. And these acids are also antimicrobial, so they can help protect against bacteria or algae that would grow on top of the lichen and block some of the sunlight, reducing the lichen's ability to photosynthesize.
So it's very good at chemical warfare is what you're saying.
Pretty much, yeah. It makes itself pretty toxic to other microscopic organisms. But that's also why it makes a good nesting material for chipmunks and birds, because it can help keep away harmful bacterias and other things that would harm the birds or the chipmunks, whatever organism is using it. The pigments that are found in the thallus, or the body of the lichen, include carotenoids and melanin, and these pigments serve as protection against strong sunlight and UV radiation. So where they live on the tree trunks or on the rocks sometimes can be exposed to direct sunlight. Like, we'll talk about how they reproduce, but they don't really have much control about where they land or establish. So wherever they're stuck is sometimes in full direct sunlight. And these pigments, the carotenoids and the melanin, can help the lichen protect itself against the UV radiation. The carotenoids can also help to an extent with photosynthesis.
It's basically a natural sunscreen.
Yeah, pretty much. And they've found that if the lichen is in direct sunlight, it will have a higher level of melanin, which is the protective pigment. And then as a result, when it's dried out, that form will be a dark brown color, whereas dried out lungwort found in shadier areas will be a greenish gray. And then the final component of the chemical cocktail was steroids, and those help maintain the lichen's cellular membranes.
So it's not a bodybuilder.
No.
It's not lifting weights. Darn.
Imagine. So that's its ecology, kind of how it survives, makes a go of it, where it lives.
Nice.
On to its reproduction. So reproduction in tree lungwort is primarily asexual, though it can also produce sexually. Asexually, it has what are called vegetative propagules. The technical terms for these are isidia or sauridia, and these vegetative propagules are the primary way it reproduces. Vegetative means that the propagules that it reproduces with are genetic clones of the parent lichen. And these propagules, they protrude from the surface of the lichen, so it looks like pretty bumpy. They're basically just fragments. They protrude and they easily fall off the thallus when the thallus is dry during this cycle of wet and dry that it's going through. So the chunk of the thallus, which is the propagule, can just kind of fall off. The surfaces of tree trunks and rocks where the lichens are found can become soaked during rain, but also extremely brittle during the spells of dry weather. When it's dry and brittle, the clonal vegetative propagules or even small fragments of the thallus can easily break off the parent and establish nearby on the same substrate or be carried away to a new place by wind or rain. So the propagules are just kind of growths, like protrusions from the thallus, but if it ends up just being a chunk of the thallus breaks off, that can also function as a vegetative propagule. So the parent kind of creates clones of itself by just breaking these off when it's dry. And then when it reproduces sexually, it reproduces through those fruiting bodies we talked about, the reddish-brown discs on the surface. Those discs produce spores, and those spores have undergone meiosis, which makes them genetically different from the parent. So that's the difference between the asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction produces clones. Sexual reproduction through spores produces a genetically unique offspring. So that's how it reproduces. Now I want to talk a little bit about conservation and the status of Loberia pulmonaria. While lungwort is found worldwide, like I said, it's extremely rare and rapidly declining, especially across Europe and in lowland areas. I think there's an emphasis on Europe because that's where a lot of the research has been done and where we have data showing that the species is declining. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not declining elsewhere, though.
Yeah, for example, typically when it comes to lichen and fungi, we have very little information, unfortunately, of its location or survivability in the southern hemisphere in general. So the fact that it's found in Africa, even being listed as found there, is a sign that, like, we probably don't know much about its habitat there or its, like, populations.
Unfortunately, it's due to a lot of factors, including colonial histories and the imperialist nature of Western science, and it is very unfortunate. I just hope it's doing okay. I know that it's likely not with a lot of the things we'll talk about that are harming it, but we just don't know. But we have the data from Europe and lowland areas showing it's rapidly disappearing. The main causes of its disappearance are intensive forest management, air pollution, and climate change. So on the forest management point, we currently are growing forests as units of economic capital, basically, for extraction of wood or paper. And so we're growing these forests with the goal of cutting the trees down as soon as possible. So as a result, these trees aren't getting as old as they used to when forests were not utilized in this way. And as a result, lichens a lot of the time don't have a chance to establish for several different reasons. The first is that bark texture surprisingly has a big impact on the lichen's ability to attach and grow on the substrate. And bark texture changes drastically throughout a tree's life. A lot of young trees have smoother bark, whereas older trees will have more textured bark. Several examples are like platy bark or very ridged bark. Sometimes there's like little triangles in the shapes. I don't know. But bark can be drastically different. It tends to be more textured on older trees, and we're cutting these trees down as soon as possible for extraction of the resources.
Yeah, I know, for example, in Pennsylvania, a lot of the forests, they are managed for wood. And so I think it's like 100-year rotation. So you won't find trees really older than 100 years old, which sounds a lot, but for a tree, not that old.
Not that old. Yeah, some older long-lived trees can live for millennia. Like some cedars on the west coast of North America can live for 1,500 plus years. I'm pretty sure maples can get to like 500 if you leave them and take good care of them. So it's unfortunate that we prioritize resource extraction over the building of communities that can foster all of these organisms, like lobaria. So that's one factor, is the age of the trees or the quality of the substrate that's available to it. Another factor is pollution. As for air quality, lungwort is similar to the green frog that we recently discussed because lungwort is also considered an indicator species. The absence of this species in a forest community is an indicator to us that the air is of poorer quality than a forest where it is found. And that's because these lichens are extremely sensitive to sulfur dioxide as well as heavy metals. So the rhizines that hold the lichen to the substrate don't help with water absorption at all. They absorb the water and atmospheric air around them directly through the surface of their body or thallus. And they absorb water in the form of rainwater, dew, or fog. So whereas plants have some protections against pollutants in the air or water, like they have a cuticle on their leaves, they have stomata to control air intake, and they also have a vascular system in the form of roots and xylem and phloem that transport food and water through their bodies. Lichens don't have any of those. Lichens lack all of those protections, so any dust or air pollutants that they're exposed to become trapped between the filaments of their body.
They're kind of like the frogs or amphibians of the non-animal world.
They're like sponges. They're very absorbent of things around them, a lot of the time to their detriment.
I will say there's actually some really cool like books and stuff you can get that tell you like, oh, if you find this lichen in this area, that means your air quality is this. And like stuff like that. Like they're a good indicator of that. There are manuals being like, these species indicate these things, which is kind of fun.
Right. It's super interesting. Like that book sounds like it kind of puts more of an emphasis on the lichen community as a whole. And it's cool how you can look at an assemblage of organisms and kind of tell what's going on in the environment around them.
Yeah, you can do that with aquatic invertebrates too, which is fun.
Yeah, super cool. So different lichens have different tolerance levels. Lungwort is one of the more sensitive ones, which is why it's so rare and declining so quickly. The last factor causing its decline is climate change, and that's because lungwort needs humid forests to survive, and many of the locations where they're currently established, based on projections, will no longer have the humid climate they need in the coming decades, with areas becoming hotter and drier. One of the studies I found was emphasizing Italy. The desertification of the Mediterranean areas of Italy is going to make this lichen disappear.
Yeah, just like think about like the droughts on the west coast too of the US.
Right. That study just happened to be in Italy, but that's probably the case for a lot of places, including the population in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest is super unique because it's a temperate rainforest, which isn't very common, but who knows what that'll look like in the future.
Protect our lichens.
Protect our lichens, protect our forests.
I love them.
Right, I know. It's scary thinking about what it'll look like, but that's something we all have to face. Anyway, so not to end on a sad note, but this is a cool little lichen.
Cool little big lichen.
Little big lichen, yeah. But after your moment of suspense, we will be rejoining to discuss how it's very queer. So we will shuffle our notes and we will be back in a minute. Hi, thanks for listening to another episode. Instead of using this space for ads, I like to promote our work because Alana and I do this independently without sponsors. For those who haven't heard, we now have a bookshop.org affiliated storefront. Alana and I are working on adding our favorite books, mostly science-related or queer. In my case, some of my favorite authors are Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, and Andrew Joseph White. So if you like any of those names and are looking for the next book to read, you might find something you like on there, and the proceeds from every purchase support this show. The link to get there is bookshop.org/shop/queerlynatural. Other ways to support this podcast are you can buy us a coffee or join our Patreon, where we will be posting extra content. Links to both those and our bookstore are in the description of this episode. You can also spread the word on social media. We are at Queerly Natural on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Shout us out or let us know what you liked about our most recent episode. Thanks again for listening, and let's get back to the show. And welcome back. So we are now going to talk about Lobaria pulmonaria, the lungwort lichen, and how it is queer.
Yay!
So you may have noticed I have called this organism a lichen. I haven't really discussed the taxonomy or how it's related to any other organisms yet. And that's because this organism is kind of a plant and kind of a fungus, but it's also both and neither. So let me explain.
Gotta love it. Who needs labels when you can have all of them and none of them?
They're their own thing.
You're special.
So lichens, they are a partnership. They're an organism, but they're a partnership between a fungus and several other partners. This type of partnership that is so intertwined and necessary for the survival of everyone involved, that partnership is called a symbiosis. Sym means same and biosis means life. And each individual partner in this symbiosis is called a symbiont. So the fungal symbiont creates the thallus or the body of the lichen. It creates the physical structure of the organism. So the taxonomic name of the lichen, for example, lungwort is Lobaria pulmonaria. That Latin name is the name of the fungus. And that fungal partner is usually an ascomycete. Ascomycetes are disc or cup fungi, and they produce spores in sacs. The sexual reproductive organ of this lichen, Lobaria, if you'll remember, is a reddish-brown disc. And that's because those discs produce sexual fungal spores. And that's how the lichen produces sexually. The fungal spore goes out and it germinates and it has to acquire all the partners and then it will form the lichen. And it's also why the lichen doesn't have roots. So roots are a plant organ and the thallus is made of a fungus. So that's why the threads holding it to the substrate, they're composed of fungal tissue. They don't absorb water or nutrients the way that plant roots do. So the fungus that forms the thallus is the first partner. It will partner up with one or two other organisms, and both of these organisms would be photosynthesizers or a photobiont. The photosynthesizer, it can be an algae and or a photosynthetic type of bacteria called a cyanobacteria.
I love cyanobacteria.
They're so cool. Photosynthesizers are unique because, as we said before, they don't need to consume food from around them. They produce their own energy or carbohydrates like sugar out of carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So that's the second and or third partner. And then in partnership, the fungus will give the lichen structure and protect the photosynthesizing partner from drying out or dying between rains or in sunlight. And then the photosynthetic partner or partners will create carbohydrates to feed themselves as well as the fungus. And that's what all lichens are. All lichens are a partnership.
If I'm not mistaken, there's actually more involved in that partnership that we keep discovering, correct?
I believe so.
I think there's another bacteria involved, or like multiple bacteria. It's wild.
I'll be so honest, it was hard enough finding any information on these three partners.
Yeah, no, I think it was only figured out like a few years ago.
Right. I think it was a different species of lichen they found it on, but I think you're right. They have found a lichen that's like composed of 4 or 5 partners, and I think there's another bacteria and a yeast involved. I'll have to find the study.
I did find that study. It was by Spribil. So sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Spribil et al. 2016, and it was a study of various lichens across 6 continents, and all were found to have a specific type of yeast in their thallus. Later studies would find the bacteria, and it's now accepted that all lichens have stable groups of associated yeasts and bacteria. So that is likely also the case for lungwort. Anytime the rest of the episode we say lungwort is a partnership of 2 or 3, know that it is really a partnership of 4 or 5 organisms.
Boy, imagine their dating pool.
Right.
We thought ours was hard. We only have to find one.
So, like, if we're right, and a lichen can be a fungus, a yeast. Those are fungi. Those are kingdom fungi. You can have algae, that's kingdom planta. And then you can have a cyanobacteria and possibly another bacteria. That's kingdom bacteria. So 3 completely different kingdoms of life. And they all are necessary components to make this organism exist.
It's wild, but also, like, it's interesting. Lichen are only ever really considered as at least, you know, a two-way mutualist with, like, a fungus and an alga or cyanobacteria. And so they're always kind of seen as that, and it makes it really weird trying to put them in any kingdom because they are too. But, like, most organisms, multicellular organisms you see are actually multi-kingdom. Like, we are a lot bacteria, but we don't view it that way. It's weird, and I love it.
We're all so weird. That's the lesson that lichens teach us, right? Like, when we name the lichen, we name the fungus, like we said. When we genetically assess the lichen, we usually only test the fungus DNA.
Well, isn't, like, that alga able to survive on its own, and the fungus is the only one that requires the partnership?
Yeah, I'll talk more about, like, the specific partners of lungwort, but a lot of the time the photosynthesizer can live independently, and the fungus is obligate, like, dependent on the partners. But I don't know if that makes, like, the fungus, like, the key player, you know, because the photosynthesizers are just as necessary to the whole thing coming together. Like, if the sexual fungal spore goes out, tries to germinate, but can't acquire the partners necessary, then it won't survive.
Yeah.
So the partners are, you know, just as necessary. But like you said, it can make you question how we relate to that, in that we need bacteria, for example, like E. coli in our guts to survive. Like, without those, we would absorb way less nutrients. It would be much more difficult. Just interesting to think about. But unlike humans, we have, like, completely different, depending on where you're from, people can have completely different communities of gut bacteria. Different species of lichens are consistently the same organisms, or sometimes a certain type of lichen can have different options of photosynthesizers. Like, they can have the option to partner with several different species of algae. Sometimes they can partner with an algae or a cyanobacteria. So you can find one sample of lichen where it's the fungus and one photosynthesizer, and then go somewhere else and find the same lichen, visually the same, like anatomically the same, but it'll have a completely different photosynthetic partner. So it's just interesting. So I guess maybe they are more like people. Like, they can vary some, but I don't think there's as much flexibility. Like, sometimes they'll have 2 or 3 options.
Lichen, question everything, including your own existence. Doo-doo-doo-doo. What is an organism?
What does it mean to be a thing? A living being? To go into lungwort specifically, lungwort belongs to a group of lichens called cyanolichens. And these cyanolichens are a fungus that can partner with either a cyanobacteria and or a green algae. Loberia pulmonaria is one of the cyanolichens that involves all 3. So there's the fungus. Like we said, it's the Latin name refers to the fungus. So that one's called Loberia pulmonaria. The green algae is Dictyochloropsis reticulata. And then the cyanobacteria is in the genus Nostoc. So Loberia pulmonaria as a fungus doesn't have options. It needs these three to survive. Specifically the Dictyochloropsis reticulata, that specific type of algae, as well as the cyanobacteria in the genus Nostoc. I didn't see any papers that identified the Nostoc species, but that's fine. Hard to pin down sometimes with bacteria. When I was describing the lichen earlier, I mentioned that the thallus has these organs called cephalodia, or spots that are darker green than the upper surface, and they're present on the underside of the thallus. So these dark green spots are characteristic of lichens that are a partnership involving the cyanobacteria, because the cephalodia, or the spots, are the visual result of Nostoc cyanobacteria on the surface of the lichen becoming enveloped. Is that how you say it? Enveloped by mycelia as the fungus grows the thallus. The cyanobacteria are also responsible for the lichen's ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen into bioavailable nitrogen. The lichen's ability to be involved in that nitrogen cycle is because the cyanobacteria give the lichen the ability to do that. If they weren't present, that wouldn't be something it could do. And especially interesting, Alana mentioned the partners don't always need to be in the partnership. The fungus does, but the green algae, Dictyochloropsis reticulata, is a photobiont. It can be in several different species of lichens. So it can be with Loberia pulmonaria or several other lichenized fungi. But it can also be found free living as an algae in the soil. So it can do its own thing, or it can partner up with several different fungi if it's in an environment where that would be beneficial for it. Nostoc, the cyanobacteria, can also be found free living independently in bodies of fresh water. There, it can be part of communities of phytoplankton, but it's just doing its own thing. And some species of Nostoc can also be found in the soil, and sometimes they can be extremely drought and heat resistant, which is also relevant to the dry-wet cycle that the lichen is exposed to. So these photosynthetic partners can be found living independently, and like I said, they'll only associate with the fungus when they are in relatively inhospitable conditions, because otherwise it's not beneficial for them to be giving up part of the food that they're photosynthesizing as like a sacrifice to the fungus, because that's basically what they're doing. They're like feeding the fungus in exchange for protection, but if that protection's not necessary, then they don't need to get involved. But that's an option for them if they are in a situation where they're caught on, a rock exposed to direct sunlight, or a tree trunk that is dry, it's 70% of the time. So especially these places with no soil and no protection from dry conditions. The lichen, as a unique assemblage of all three partners, develops adaptations to help all the symbionts involved to thrive in relationship with each other. So for example, we mentioned the lichen produces, or specifically the lichenized fungus produces the pigments in the thallus, including the melanin that protects it from direct sunlight. And that's specifically because without the melanin, the green algae, D. reticulata, that green algae is very sensitive to high light exposure. So without the chemical produced by the fungus, that photobiont wouldn't survive. So I've been describing this as like a mutually beneficial relationship. Some people have posed the idea that lichens are a fungus farming a photobiont, which to them I think implies a sort of negative connotation, like a removal of agency of the photobiont, like the fungus is in charge and, controlling it for its benefit. But personally, I don't think that's an accurate way to view it when these photobionts have the option to live independently. And we can find them free living in situations where it's not beneficial for them to be with the fungus. So personally, since they have that option, they do have agency. I don't know. But I view it as, I think it should be described as a relationship because they can live without the relationship, but it's very helpful in adverse conditions. So that's why they're queer. What are they? They don't fit any labels at all.
Beautiful. They're beautiful. What can we say?
Yeah.
It's not Adam and Eve. It's Adam and Steve and all their associated microflora.
We're all just microbe hotels.
Well, thank you so much, Sage, for teaching us about the lichens, about this beautiful, beautiful lichen.
You're so welcome. It's gorgeous. Check out our socials. We'll post pictures.
Yes, of course. Lots and lots of photos. And probably a lot of puns. You can blame me for that one.
No, nobody can.
I mean, you can. Doesn't mean I'm gonna stop.
Nor should you.
But hey, until next time, be who you are, love who you will, and remember, you're queerly natural. Bye!
Queerly Natural was created by Ilana Zeitzer, Sage Roden, and Elizabeth Furman, with music by Migfist20. Visual design for the show is done by Ilana Zeitzer. Editing and production is done by Sage Roden. To get updates about the podcast, follow us at Queerly Natural on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We also upload all of our sources and episode transcripts to our website, queerlynatural.com. If you liked what you heard today and would like to support the show, contributions can be made on Patreon or Ko-fi, or you can spread the word and tell your friends. Thank you so much for listening, and join us every first Wednesday of the month for a new episode. Until next time, stay queer and remember clearly, it's natural.